It's June 2023, which means Pride Month is here. And while it can be easy to get swept up in the vibrant celebrations and festivities that take place this time of year, we should also take some time to remember why we're celebrating in the first place. Throughout most of recent history, LGBTQ people have been systematically denied their rights, their safety, and even their very humanity. But thanks to the tireless efforts of countless activists over the years, we now have many more freedoms than our ancestors did. Here's a brief history of the LGBTQ rights movement to help you better understand where your rights come from and why they're worth protecting. The fight for equal access to education predates the modern LGBTQ rights movement by at least 1 century. In the early 19th century, several activists began advocating for sex education in schools, though they often couched their calls for change in terms of public morality rather than human rights. One of the earliest advocates for sex education was the British reformer John Ellis, who published a pamphlet entitled A Parent's and Teacher is Guide to the Knowledge of the Human Body in 1834. Realizing that young people were curious about their own bodies, Ellis argued that parents and teachers had a moral obligation to provide them with accurate information. He wrote, "Much mischief might be prevented, and much misery and suffering be saved by impressing on the youthful mind the knowledge of the laws which govern our nature." But not everyone agreed. The medical community was split on the issue, and it wasn't until 1927 that Ellis's ideas were finally adopted by the British national curriculum. Still, his contributions helped lay the foundation for future LGBTQ advocates. For most of the 19th and early 20th centuries, homosexuality was considered a mental illness in the US and Canada and many other countries around the world. This harmful classification not only stripped LGBTQ people of their rights, but also allowed for coercive and often brutal forms of therapy known as conversion therapy to be used against them. It wasn't until 1973 that the American Psychiatric Association removed homosexuality from its Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, or DSM. This decision was the culmination of decades of work by activists like Frank Kameny, a mathematician who'd been fired from his job at the State Department for being gay. After being denied the ability to appeal his dismissal on the grounds that he wasn't a, quote, regular practicing citizen, Kameny became an outspoken advocate for LGBTQ rights. In 1950, he helped found the Mattachine Society, one of the earliest gay rights organizations in the US. And in 1960, he organized the first demonstration in Washington, D.C. for LGBTQ rights. His efforts, along with those of many others, eventually paid off when the APA recognized that there was no scientific basis for classifying homosexuality as a mental disorder. If you've watched our videos on the Stonewall Riots or the history of Pride, then you already know how pivotal this moment was for the LGBTQ rights movement. But it's important to remember that the Stonewall Inn wasn't the first space where LGBTQ people resisted police harassment and state-sponsored violence. Decades earlier, another New York City establishment known as the Jewel was providing a safe haven for gay men. On the evening of September 25, 1927, however, the Jewel was raided by the police, who arrested 29 patrons and employees, including 19-year-old Zenobievsky. Unlike many of his peers, Zenon decided to fight his arrest, which resulted in him becoming the first person in U.S. history to successfully argue in court that the police had violated his constitutional rights. Writing in the New York Times, Justice John P. Kelby stated, "This court will not enforce an unconstitutional law. A policeman is not allowed to search a man's private parts unless he has a search warrant based on probable cause, just as he would have to do if he wanted to search the man's pockets." Unfortunately, this ruling only applied to Zenobievsky and didn't have any bearing on other raids that took place at the Jewel or other LGBTQ spaces over the next few decades. But it did establish an important legal precedent that would eventually lead to more widespread change. In 1950, 8 transgender people filed a lawsuit against the state of Illinois after they were denied marriage licenses. Their case, which was eventually heard by the Illinois Supreme Court, was based on the belief that since transgender people were legally barred from changing their gender markers, they couldn't prove that they were, quote, unrelated to their previous spouses, which was a requirement for getting married at the time. Though the court ultimately ruled against them, their efforts paved the way for future legal challenges to discriminatory laws. But it was in the 1960s and 70s that the momentum for LGBTQ rights really started to grow. In 1966, the Compton Riots, which saw over 200 members of the Compton police force and 500 civilians violently clash with each other, demonstrated the need for LGBTQ people to have legal protections. After a series of deadly incidents, including a drag queen being shot by a police officer, the City Council of Compton, California passed the nation's first anti-discrimination ordinance protecting sexual orientation. Over the next decade, similar ordinances were adopted by cities across the country, demonstrating growing support for LGBTQ people at the local level. In 1972, a group of activists led by Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson organized the Christopher Street Liberation Day March to commemorate the one-year anniversary of the Stonewall Riots. This event, which attracted over 200 participants, is widely considered to be the first Pride Parade. 4 years later, the Gay Activist Alliance, or GAA, began holding annual Reminder Day demonstrations to call attention to the ongoing discrimination faced by LGBTQ people. The GAA specifically targeted the media, organizing die-ins, picketing, protests, and even the occasional car chase. These events were covered by major news outlets, exposing millions of Americans to the realities of life as an LGBTQ person at a time when very little was known or understood about sexual orientation and gender identity. By the late 1970s, the LGBTQ rights movement was gaining steam, and activists began focusing on one of the most significant issues facing their community: healthcare. At the time, many doctors refused to treat LGBTQ patients, and even some hospitals wouldn't admit them if they were sick. Activists responded by founding community-based health centers to provide much-needed services that were unavailable elsewhere. One of the first of these centers was the Gay and Lesbian Community Health Center, which opened in San Francisco in 1978. Its founders hoped that by offering culturally competent care in a welcoming environment, they could improve the health outcomes for LGBTQ people in their community. Today, there are dozens of LGBTQ community health centers across the US, which provide vital services to millions of people each year. But despite these growing grassroots efforts, LGBTQ people were still routinely denied their basic rights and subjected to horrific acts of violence. In 1977, Anita Bryant, an outspoken opponent of gay rights, spearheaded a campaign to repeal a Miami Beach ordinance that prohibited discrimination based on sexual orientation. She gained enough signatures to put the issue to a vote and persuaded many of her supporters to boycott local businesses that supported the ordinance. When the measure was defeated, Bryant went on to lead similar campaigns in other cities, which culminated in the 1992 passage of Amendment 2 in Colorado. This amendment, which was widely seen as a direct response to the growing LGBTQ rights movement, barred any government entity in Colorado from enacting anti-discrimination laws protecting sexual orientation or gender identity. Faced with this blatant act of discrimination, the American Civil Liberties Union stepped in. With the ACLU's help, 2 gay men and 1 woman challenged Amendment 2 in federal district court. Though their case was initially dismissed, it was eventually taken up by the U.S. Supreme Court. In a 6-4 decision, the court ruled that Amendment 2 was unconstitutional. Writing for the majority, Justice Anthony Kennedy stated that Amendment 2 served to, quote, impose a flat prohibition on the recognition of a class of persons for purposes of state law, and that class is unalterably immutable. While this ruling was a major victory, there was still a long way to go before LGBTQ people were fully recognized under the law. In 2003, Massachusetts became the first state to legalize same-sex marriage, though it wasn't until 5 years later that the landmark case, Obergefell v. Hodges, made it legal nationwide. Similarly, while transgender people have been fighting for the right to serve openly in the military since the 1970s, it wasn't until 2021 that they were finally allowed to do so. And even though we've come a long way since the days when homosexuality was considered a mental illness, and conversion therapy was considered a legitimate form of treatment. There's still plenty of progress to be made. Conversion therapy is still legal in all but 3 states, and same-sex and interracial marriage is illegal in many countries around the world. But thanks to the courageous activism of countless individuals throughout history, the LGBTQ rights movement has come a long way and continues to move forward every day. So happy Pride from all of us here at The Info. And remember, if you want to learn more about the LGBTQ experience, you can find additional resources in the description below. Thanks for watching.